Welcome back to The Empire Never Ended. It's me, Boris, and I'm here today with Ray. How you doing, Ray?
Hi. Hello.
We are also very happy to be joined today by Andrew Palella, who is a doctoral student at Boston College. Welcome to the show first, Andrew.
Hey, thank you.
Andrew, you, if I understand correctly, your doctoral research is on extremist movements in the 1930s in the United States, which is pretty interesting for us for some of our previous arcs. But you're not here to talk about that today. I I had an amusing thought before this. So over the years of covering the O9A, we have been let's say criticized by David Myatt or the Seven Oxonians for our japery, for not taking this seriously, for not having any peer-reviewed articles and academic studies published on the O9A. And so I want to say in your face, David Myatt, because you have done exactly that. You have a really great, extensive article called Towards the Galactic Imperium, The Order of Nine Angles, Cosmic Accelerationism, and the Occult Politics of Neo-Fascism, which came out in the Journal for the Study of Radicalism, right? A couple years ago?
No, actually, this
year.
summer.
It's this past summer.
Yes, the summer 2024 edition, but it was published in 2025. I don't really understand why. But
yeah, I mean, you sent it to us a while back, and it's a really, like I said, it's a very comprehensive study, and it's really well done. So we're very happy to have you here.
Well, thank you. I appreciate it. Doing that research is actually how I found your show. Because there is there is so little by way of outsider perspectives on the Order of Nine Angles. So yeah, that's how I found your podcast.
Well, yeah, I'm glad you did, because it's a very particular bunch of us that have been researching the O9A, and it does kind of fuck with your head sometimes, and it's nice to meet others who have read through the same material and have not gone completely nuts.
Yeah, I mean, and I'm particularly grateful that Andrew did what he did, because I did not want to read all of the bullshit that David Myatt wrote. It's very painful to do that. I mean, I did read some of it, but there's 10,000 pages of that. It's definitely too much.
And that was the extraordinarily frustrating and maddening thing about doing this research was I knew there was some sort of internal coherence, not something that a normal person would recognize as coherence from the outside looking in, but if you're able to kind of suspend that outsider's perspective and try to adopt the internalist perspective that this is real, people believe in this, how does it make sense to somebody who's real and believes in that? And I got that idea from a really old influential essay in American history called The Paranoid Style in American Politics by this guy named Richard Hofstadter, who basically says at the end of it, paranoid people in politics have an unhistorical understanding of history, and they do this quote unquote higher paranoid scholarship to help make sense of the world. And I kind of recognized that in the body of work of David Myatt was, okay, this would qualify as quote unquote higher paranoid scholarship, where this man is generating his own understanding of the world that is incredibly and exceedingly bizarre. But if you can sift through all of it, you can string together how it works from the inside out. And I think I wrote in my paper, there's no linear way to approach this. There's no read this, then read that. It's all fragmented, and you really have to spend a ton of time reading the bullshit, let it sit with you, and then start to draw the connections. And I did this to my own detriment without any sort of research or software manager. So I just have notebooks and notebooks and notebooks. And the notebooks look like the writings of a crazy person, because it's cross references and lines and sticky notes and tons of it. But
all the crazy terminology too, right? Because the O9A is chock full of they have their own lexicon and all that kind of stuff. And just getting to understand that makes you also feel like you're nuts.
A nut job.
Yeah.
And not just their own made up words, but then also, and this was probably the most difficult part of the research, was that section about David Myatt's own translations and reinterpretations of ancient Greek texts in order to then justify their own terminology, worldview, an outlook. And I'm not a classicist. You mentioned I study the modern 20th century American far right. I don't study ancient Greek. So I had to learn a little bit of ancient Greek and then be able to, translate or compare the, accepted translations with David Myatt's translations to look for the deviance and meaning, and then how David Myatt applies his own deviant translations to support the quote unquote truth and reality of the Order of Nine Angles worldview.
Okay.
How do his translations add up by your estimation? Is he as much of a classicist as he says he is?
I don't think I'm qualified to answer that. But what was interesting, though, is he didn't seem to make anything up because, and I mean, this is how much of not a classicist I am. I didn't know, and this is silly, but I didn't know that ancient Greek doesn't translate one-to-one the way, say, French and English or Spanish and English do. So yeah, that should demonstrate how little I know about the ancient languages. But from my comparing the different words and the different modern lexicons, which are essentially encyclopedias of different meanings of the different words with references to all the texts where the different meanings come from, it did seem like David Myatt didn't make anything up. He just selectively chose reinterpretations that would justify his ideology, which I think is interesting. And there is something to be said for, like, there's a journalist, Julie Wright, in the early 2000s who called him like a deeply disturbed intellectual and theologian of terror. I think that's a pretty accurate statement because this man he's clearly not stupid, not to give him credit, but he put obviously a lot of time and energy into creating an incredibly aberrant and deviant kind of, worldview that has sucked other people in. And that's, the biggest problem.
Sure. So your article is very long, and it's about, as you said, the Order of Nine Angles or David Myatt's worldview. How would you qualify that? Is that a theology? Is it like a kind of a mystical, political worldview? What is it?
I called it a cosmopolitical worldview, which is somewhat a term of art of my own choosing, which is meant to demonstrate the synthesis of a cosmology, like an understanding of the world, and politics. Because the whole purpose of my article was to try to understand how does this bizarre, quote unquote, satanic worldview interact with the real world politics of terrorism. But, and I go through some of the literature earlier in the article about modern esotericism to argue that, yes, it's not a religion, but it qualifies as a modern esoteric tradition. And it's a syncretic tradition. It draws on a bunch of other different forms of esoteric traditions to create this new one in the late 21st or late 20th century. And I'm not a scholar of esotericism. Again, I study primarily political extremism. So to answer your question, I think it's the synthesis of esotericism, a concocted worldview that deals with history, politics, the cosmos, and then, of course, real life politics and terrorism.
Okay, so I compiled a list of questions that kind of goes through your article. I don't know, Boris, if you wanted to ask something before we go into that.
Well, I did want to just, because our listeners are pretty familiar with our, online fights with O9A people, and especially particularly around the topic of the identity of Anton Long, right? This is something that you make the bold assertion that Myatt is Long. And can you give some probative evidence, as Myatt would say, of this?
That Myatt's an asshole because he's always always wants everybody to be able to prove it in a court of law. And look, I'm not an attorney,
right?
But a couple other scholars have looked for admissions via email or on blog posts. I tried to take a different approach, which was to develop what I call, quote unquote, David Myatt's intellectual fingerprint, which is to say the repetitions of exceedingly specific ideas across the Reichsfolk and Nazi writings of David Myatt and the esoteric writings for the Order of Nine Angles by Anton Long, and to show that they are at their core exactly the same.
Right.
And those ideas are so exceedingly niche and obscure that there's no way two different people have independently used the same terms of phrase to describe the same bizarre concept. I also looked at the ways in which David Myatt skirts the question of whether or not he is Anton Long, because he never really says it's not me. He always puts it back on the interviewer to say, "Where is your probative evidence?"
Yes.
And I think I quoted also, if I recall correctly, a couple other writings by Order of Nine Angles, people who claim to be members of the Order of Nine Angles, particularly this one, what I think is a pen name of David Myatt, but Rachel Sterling. They use the exact same rhetorical oblique refutations that Anton Long is David Myatt. And so I tried to develop this constellation of ideas and perspectives and logics to show that it's all the same. Essentially, I think it's the same person making the same arguments with different words under different pseudonyms to argue that there's really only one person saying this, and that one person is David Myatt under the pen name Anton Long, also under the pen name Rachel Sterling.
Yeah, and I mean that actually kind of jives with their whole, philosophy of obfuscation, right? And using names and all that kind of stuff. But yeah, I was going to ask you about Rachel Sterling too, because that was always very funny to me when he interviews himself as Rachel Sterling. Again, using terms that like nobody else would know, especially not somebody who's like, he claimed that she was some sort of like an academic or researcher, right? Like,
yes.
And
but, yeah. And I think I called, the three sources that Rachel Sterling wrote that I used, I think I call them pseudo-secondary sources on the Order of Nine Angles, because it is, that higher paranoid scholarship, the quotations and footnotes and cross-references. And I really do think I have a long expository footnote about Rachel Sterling and David Myatt. I didn't put it in the body of my paper, but that's where I make the argument that they're likely one and the same person, because literally nobody is interested in a sympathetic approach to the Order of Nine Angles worldview, except for Rachel Sterling.
Yeah. And I think in their kind of mythology, or his mythology, Rachel Sterling is the wife of Richard Sterling, who was also, I think, one of the names used by David Myatt. And Richard Sterling was in the early 2000s involved with Aryan nations in the US.
Interesting.
When Joshua Sutter was one of the leaders there. You can find like in the archive webpage of the Aryan nations from like 2002 to 2003 that one of the leaders there is Wolfram Hall, which is Joshua Sutter, who also uses his real name on the website. And then you have Richard Sterling, who's like the Aryan nations minister for Ice Folk.
Oh wow!
That's a dead ringer right there.
Exactly. Yeah.
Right. Reichsvolk and his idea of ethical national socialism as a whole. That's one of the one of the non-esoteric sets of writings that I looked at in order to further the argument that David Myatt is also Anton Long. And I do believe one of the really funniest things that I found that Rachel Sterling had written was that David Myatt uses a hyphen between ethical and national socialism to distinguish it from National Socialism, as if that makes it that hyphen makes it an amoral as opposed to immoral, which is just a positively absurd and pathetic argument.
Yeah,
that's in the footnotes too, I believe. Yeah.
Okay, so you use the word exoteric writings of the Order of Nine Angles. So in your article, you define this kind of distinction between esoteric and exoteric when it comes to the ideas of the Order of Nine Angles. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so I kind of got that idea to use that framework from the Order of Nine Angles itself. Rachel Sterling does refer to esoteric and exoteric writings. Of course, the Order of Nine Angles, central to their ideology and worldview, is the idea of the causal and the acausal. The acausal is kind of the metaphysical half of the universe and the cosmos, whereas the causal is everything that happens in real life to flesh and blood on the physical earth. And as I was reading through this ginormous set of sources, both Fenrir, I think I used 14 volumes of Fenrir, and then some of their, what I call the esoteric sources, which elucidate, the sevenfold sinister tradition, the steps towards initiation, the star game, the interaction between the causal and the acausal. I use exoteric to describe their prescriptions for political terrorism and their what they call kind of the aggression against the ethos of the Nazarene or the Magian, and then esoteric, of course, to describe all the things that are supposed to happen inside the body and the mind and the cosmos of the Order of Nine Angles adherents.
Okay. So they use also some kind of a more kind of umbrella terms. So one of which is the Labyrinthos Mythologicus, and then there's also what they call the Sevenfold Way or the Sevenfold Sinister Tradition or just the Sinister Tradition. Can you also explain some of these terms?
Yes, and I want to say too, in this interview, I'm going to speak a lot and just kind of say what they say, and I just want to make it clear that I'm not endorsing, and I'm not calling it real either. But it's hard to disqualify every single sentence. So,
sure.
So the Labyrinthos Mythologicus is the full corpus of their body of esoteric and exoteric material. Rachel Sterling says it is designed to test, select, and essentially weed out those who are not willing to go through the hard, arduous journey of adherence to the Order of Nine Angles ideology. Sterling has some quote in one of the texts about most people just give up in the face of the Labyrinthos Mythologicus. And I personally took that on as a challenge. I said, bullshit, I'm going to figure this out and show it for what it is. And the Labyrinthos Mythologicus is the full body of work that tells somebody who's interested what the sevenfold sinister tradition is, or the sevenfold path, or the sevenfold sinisterly numinous tradition. There's a whole bunch of different terms that the Order of Nine Angles uses to describe it. But the sevenfold sinister path is essentially a 7-step process that somebody who's interested follows in order to self-adhere and learn the insights of the Order of Nine Angles. And the first step is immersing yourself in the ideology and the teachings of David Myatt or Anton Long in order to basically string together all the disparate esoteric teachings to arrive at an enlightened gnosis or state of enhanced metaphysical understanding of both the acausal and the causal. So there's 7 steps to it, one of which is the insight roll. The second to last step is the grade ritual of the abyss. And after the initiate passes the grade ritual of the abyss, according to the ideology, they have transmuted themselves internally into a mistress or a master of the Order of Nine Angles, which is supposed to give them the full understanding of the cosmos, how the causal and the acausal interact, and the ability to manipulate the ages, the universe, the earth, the cosmos with aeonic magic, which is a form of left-hand path magic of David Myatt's own design that relies on what they call culling, defiance, and crime, which we would recognize as terrorism, pedophilia, etc., in order to help evolve the ages towards the next aeon, out of the Western Aryan aeon towards the galactic aeon, in which the evolved race of Order of Nine Angles magicians will then populate the galaxy with a new race called Homo Galactica. And it is gobbledygook. Like it sounds like Warhammer. It sounds like a video game. It's truly absurd, but for whatever reason, people do buy into this, and that's the most bizarre thing.
So you mentioned like child abuse stuff now, and this is something that some of them, I think David Myatt, using a lot of his different identities, claims was never a part of that whole thing. That this is something that Joshua Sutter put like inside in kind of this fake version of the Order of Nine Angles created by Joshua Sutter. So do you have anything to say about that?
I do. I call bullshit on David Myatt. Now, I can't point to a single text before the Temple of Blood that identifies child abuse and pedophilia. However, all the pre-Temple of Blood texts that David Myatt wrote to construct the Labyrinthos Mythologicus makes the argument that evil is not actually evil. Evil is actually the amoral state of nature, and so anything that that Magian logic or the ethos of the Nazarene would call evil is actually permissible and okay. So the way I view it is David Myatt is making a blanket argument for all sorts of transgression, not only to be appropriate, acceptable, amoral, but also desired in order to transgress the ethos of the Nazarene, which is really coded for the Jews. All things that transgress liberalism, what he calls Jewish ideology, democracy, rule of law, is permitted and desired. And so he sets up a worldview where there is blanket permission to do everything that is we would recognize as evil. And so the Temple of Blood, I think, takes that and runs with it and infuses that permission set with specifically pedophilia, amongst other things.
Well, there was that text, the Girl Goddess, which is a pro-pedophile text published, I think, in Fenrir, definitely much before Sutter was ever involved in the Order of Nine Angles. And Myatt was asked about that text by Nick Lowles when he interviewed him, when Myatt denied that he's Anton Long and had anything to do with the Order of Nine Angles. And he said it himself, how that is a disgusting text. And
I can't remember if it's Girl Goddess or another one, where the story is they're two young girls in a bookshop and they basically bump into David Myatt in the bookshop, and the girls are looking at Order of Nine Angles texts, and it's only things they've ever seen on the internet before, and they have this they literally turn the corner and run into David Myatt, and there's this weird, electric touch, and hands are where they shouldn't be, and then they go home and read more about the Order of Nine Angles, and then they sleep with their father. It is purely disgusting. But that's
I think that's a bit later one. Yeah.
Okay.
I think, if I remember correctly, but I'm not sure.
It's tough to keep. I can't keep all of the dates of all the different stories in Fenrir organized off the top of my head. But I think that's an example of the type of thing that the Order of Nine Angles. And again, what's so insidious too about the Order of Nine Angles is that there isn't a singular arbiter of what is correct canon or ideology. It is self-perpetuating. And in fact, one of the Fenrir texts after 2009 basically says the Order of Nine Angles is back like a virus. And of course, inside of that statement is the ability to spread and mutate and take on different forms. And so I come back to the statement that I think David Myatt set up a worldview where evil is considered amoral, without morals, neither good nor bad, but it is also at the same time desired. And so I think I don't think the Order of Nine Angles or Myatt can say pedophilia is not a part of this.
Right.
And they have a pretty kind of teenage understanding of like Nietzschean beyond good and evil. For them, it just means evil, I would say.
Yes. They also identify Nietzsche's, sickness of the spirit with the influence of the Jews upon the world, basically. Right. And that comes into play a little bit later on. It's all very juvenile, too.
Yeah, absolutely.
So what is homo hubris?
Oh, boy. Homo hubris is everybody. It's everybody who's not the Order of Nine Angles. It is everybody who resisted Nazism. It's democracy. Homo hubris is democracy and capitalism at the same time. It's the people of the East and the West who don't self-adhere into the Order of Nine Angles. And it's a very, as I mentioned in the article, it's a very all-encompassing idea that homo hubris is everybody who refuses the true knowledge of the universe, which is the Order of Nine Angles. If you give me a second, I have a good quote printed out about who exactly homo hubris is. So if you give me a second to find it.
Sure.
Homo hubris, according to David Myatt, are the supine masses who, for the most part, are manipulated and molded by a powerful, arrogant, and often wealthy and privileged self-appointed elite, which use their control or influence over such things as the media, the entertainment industry, advertising, business, banking, politicians, and political parties, and have manufactured the soulless, mostly urban societies of the modern, industrialized, so-called democratic world, where some abstract progress has become a god to be worshipped and obeyed, where the mumbo-jumbo of usurious banking has hypnotized generation and generation, and where the impersonal manufactured law of mostly corrupt and dishonorable self-serving politicians is stupidly regarded as representing justice. It is a very tired, retelling of the idea of Judeo-Bolshevism
Yeah.
and the idea that the Jews have poisoned Western society with somehow both with democracy and with communism and with
Hmm.
capitalism and with socialism.
Yeah.
Yeah. So basically, everyone who's a part of the Jew-controlled world
Mhm.
is a part of the Homo hubris, which
Yes.
also kind of justifies seeing humanity as a kind of an enemy, right?
Yes.
Mm.
Yeah, baked into that is the essentially the assumption that the the Jews have poisoned the entire world with relativism and democracy and communism, and so uh, they must be destroyed. And what's very interesting to me is that this doesn't necessarily come out of the Third Reich. It comes out of who I mentioned in the article, Francis Parker Yockey,
Yeah.
who
Hmm.
takes the ideology of the Nazis and essentially turbocharges it in 1948, and basically names every structure outside of Aryan fascism to be the enemy of the white Aryan Western man.
Yeah. We'll talk about Yoki more. But
Okay.
I wanted to ask, like, so they also talk about de-evolutionary forces and the de-evolutionary mythos, and they are
Mhm.
supposedly in revolt against these things. What does this mean?
Good question. So, so again, part and parcel of the Order of Nine Angles, what I call their cosmopolitical worldview, is a belief that that history is somewhat preordained, and that there will be 7 ages of evolution um, of mankind. And that idea is lifted from Helena Blavatsky and the
Yeah.
idea
Yeah.
of root races. And Myatt identifies that that humanity and the earth and the cosmos are in the fifth aeon, the Western aeon, the center of which was the Third Reich, and that the ages in the cosmos, which is a representation of space and time, only evolves when when the magical forces and the spiritual ethos of the competing civilizations in any set aeon, there's a balance is tipped, and then
Hmm.
the aeons kind of fall into the next evolutionary the next preordained evolutionary age. And Myatt makes the argument that because the Nazis were unsuccessful, the ethos of the Western Aryan man was not able to magically influence the spirit of the age enough to move the Western Aeon into the following Aeon. And so humanity and Homo hubris and Homo galactica are locked in this spiritual magical duel to either evolve forward or keep everything as they are. And
Hmm.
Myatt claims that the de-evolutionary ethos of the Nazarene or the Magian is the influence of the Jews upon the Western Aeon, which basically, yeah, prevents history from proceeding.
Mhm.
And as a historian, what's interesting to me in that is Myatt is essentially trying to develop a philosophy of history, say the way Karl Marx developed the material dialectics of history, where he argues that material conditions are the primary driver of changes in history. Myatt is trying to invent his own philosophy of history that says magical energies are the driver and the engine of history. It
Yeah.
again, very silly, but if you adopt his perspective, you can kind of see how it would work in the minds of an adherent to the Order of Nine Angles.
Yeah. So unlike Evola and the traditionalist, Myatt is actually like pro-evolutionary, right?
Yes,
Yeah.
he believes that. Yeah, and so again, like I mentioned before we recorded, the search for perfect coherence amongst these ideologies is a fool's errand
Yeah.
because at once, David Myatt's non-esoteric ethical National Socialism and Reichsfolk is a traditionalist approach, a return to the earth, the return to the separation of the races, and he calls that a return to the state of nature where there are natural hierarchies. But
Hmm.
then when you look at the Order of Nine Angles, it is still a traditionalist argument about the return to nature, but that nature naturally evolves and orders society and cultures according to prehistorically ordained hierarchies, which actually push towards evolution as opposed to tradition and stagnation.
Yeah. So it should be basically allowed to naturally evolve, which
Mhm.
according to him would happen if there was no Jewish intervention in history, I guess.
Correct.
Yeah.
If the Jews had been fully destroyed during World War II,
Yeah.
Homo Galactica would have been 500 years closer to establishing the Galactic Imperium, which is the empire of space magicians that will live eternally forever.
Yeah. I think Myatt likes the Star Trek episodes when when they're in the other dimension where it's not the Federation, it's like the Terran Empire is ruling I don't know, not a part of the universe. I think that this is what he would prefer, like the empire that he talks about. It's like something from those episodes, I think.
Yes, and it's incredibly vague too in all of the material. I mean, there's no point at where does this empire actually exist? What parts of the universe does it cover? It is, like I said, this is why I said it sounds like Warhammer. It's kind of pure science fiction. And one of the more interesting things too that I found while researching Myatt's biography, and of course he's written his own biographies, and Rachel Sterling has written a biography of David Myatt. So you have to read these sources, with a sense of skepticism, but you can kind of see the seeds of the Order of Nine Angles all over David Myatt's retelling of his own childhood, where he's raised in colonial Tanzania, I believe, and he claims that he studied Sanskrit and Latin and Greek, and he was obsessed with space travel as a kid. And he grew up and concocted this incredibly disgusting, diabolical worldview to kind of satisfy his childish impulses. And I'm not a psychologist or a psychiatrist, but I think somebody more qualified could find some interesting
for sure
conclusions in that. Yeah.
And who's Vindex?
Vindex, the Avenger. Vindex is essentially the causal figure who will appear on Earth, possibly as the Antichrist, that will help that will lead the forces of Homo Galactica, or the Order of Nine Angles, to fully and finally destroy the ethos of Homo Hubris. It's also a representation of their idea of Satan, which is really not it's not the biblical Antichrist. It's what he calls a convenient antinomian label for the primordial forces of the universe that only the Order of Nine Angles have been able to properly understand and apprehend. And they just choose the word Satan because it is the opposite of everything that is Jewish. They also lump Christianity in with Judaism because, Jesus Christ was born a Jew.
Right.
So Vindex is everything all at once. Vindex is the physical avenger. He is the physical leader of the empire. He is also the symbol, the sigil and the symbol of Satan, which is the symbol of the transgressive and antinomian ethos of the Order of Nine Angles, which guides adherents of the Order of Nine Angles in their search or quest to evolve the aeons with culling, defiance, crime, killing, terrorism, rape, murder, etc.
They, I think, often compare Vindex to Hitler in some way.
Right.
Right.
I've seen
Yes.
the images of Hitler with the sigil of Vindex instead of the swastika and stuff like that a lot. Yeah.
Yeah. So Vindex is not strictly Adolf Hitler. They said in some of the teaching, well, sorry, I don't mean teachings, but some of the writings in Hostia, and I don't know how to pronounce really any of these books, but I call it Hostia. And Hostia argues that Adolf Hitler was a brief manifestation of Vindex, because for a brief and glorious moment, the Third Reich was the representation of Satan on Earth in its quest to eradicate the world of the Jews. So yeah, Vindex is likened to Adolf Hitler, but Adolf Hitler is not Vindex.
Right. That kind of seems to be borrowing a bit from, I guess, Savitri Devi and that kind of esoteric Hitler's tradition of Hitler being like a manifestation of like an avatar or something. Yeah.
Yes. And he says, Myatt writes in Hostia that, for a brief and glorious moment, the forces of Satan were manifested in the Third Reich. It's very much a representation of the ideology.
Yeah. Okay, I had a question about the distinction between causal and acausal. I think you covered that already, unless you want to add something to it. But also, I wanted to ask, what is the significance of the Tree of Weird and the progression of the 7 aeons, and how does this reflect in the initiation of the Order of Nine Angles?
Yes. Okay. So this is one of the more complicated teachings of the Order of Nine Angles. And the Tree of Weird, which I understand weird to be an Old English word that kind of means destiny. David Myatt, of course, reinterprets that to mean above one's destiny or past destiny, the ability to influence your own will upon the destiny of yourself and the world, which is a kind of left-hand path esoteric teaching. But the Tree of Weird is a pictorial representation of the cosmology of the Order of Nine Angles. And this is where some of the scholarship by Nicholas Goodrick Clark and this other guy, Arthur Versluis, and another person named Antoine Favre, something like that. They do scholarship on what is an esoteric tradition, what are the markers of esotericism, and one of the things that they point to are symbolic mediations of the teachings of a esoteric ideology. And so the Tree of Weird is a pictorial representation of the 7 steps of initiation into the Order of Nine Angles, with also the causal and acausal realms of existence, you could say, strata of existence, the physical and the metaphysical overlaid. And so you have the 7 steps of initiation, the seven classical planets, and then you have as above, so below. You have the Earth, and then you have the stars, which is the representation of the esoteric cosmology and the acausal realm. So together, 7 plus 2, 9. The Order of Nine Angles. It's a pictorial representation of the teachings of initiation and hermetic transmutation from Homo hubris to Homo galactica.
Okay. And does this reflect also in their political goals?
Yes, because you have to reach the 7th step of initiation in order to fully understand the form of magic that the Order of Nine Angles claims it applies to help combat the de-evolutionary ethos of the Nazarene, which is antinomian transgression. I mean, it is rape, murder, culling, and crime. They believe that all of these physical crimes have an acausal or magical or metaphysical effect on the health of the magical balance of the aeon. And if you do enough of this bad stuff, it will defeat the de-evolutionary magical influence of the Jews and will tip the balance towards the 6th aeon and the 7th aeon, which is the Galactic Imperium.
Right.
Got it.
It is so silly. It's worth laughing about.
No, I mean, you're doing a fantastic job of trying to make sense of this. I'm really, I'm in awe here. Yeah.
It took me years. It took me years to understand all of this material and to be able to translate it in a way that would be legible to normal people, whether that be other scholars or people like yourselves who do a great podcast, or just interested parties, or other news reporters. It was difficult. It was really difficult to try to succinctly explain why this stuff makes sense from the inside out. And I'd never seen anybody else do that before, and that kind of was my challenge to myself.
Me neither.
Yeah.
It's your text has 70 pages without the footnotes, I think, or endnotes.
And there's about 40 pages of footnotes as well, and some of them make other smaller arguments. This actually started as a seminar paper for a research paper for when I was in my master's at the University of Colorado Springs, for an ancient history paper. And like I said earlier, I hate ancient history. It's just not for me. But I knew that the Order of Nine Angles stuff had some, oblique references to the ancient world. And I figured, that's how I'll qualify doing this research for that course. And the original version of this paper was really incomplete. It was maybe 40 pages. And so I spent 2 years after writing that paper, adding to it and finishing it and continuing the research to create the 70-page paper with, 30 pages or whatever it is of footnotes.
How was it sourcing all the material? I know that this has been kind of a challenge for us too, and also just like having things like Fenrir and stuff can be a little bit sketchy.
Yeah, I can
Requiring
talk
it.
about that.
Yeah, please do. Yeah.
Yeah. So I started collecting this material in 2019, actually. So, many years ago, before the Order of Nine Angles was really difficult to find and purchase on the internet. So I do have many really rare Order of Nine Angles texts in my personal collection that I had been just kind of purchasing as I saw them over the years, just out of a mild curiosity. Again, my main academic interest is political extremism in the United States, but I have a pretty large collection of extremist literature that I use for my research. And then I kind of thumbed through it. Like I had the Codex Saris or Saries, whatever it is, the Black Book of Satan. I thumbed through that. I had another hardcover book, I think, called The Sinister Tradition, which now sells for hundreds of dollars, which I probably bought that for like $50 back in 2019. I wouldn't recommend anybody try to invest in Order of Nine Angles material, but the price goes up. And then so when I started planning to do this research, I got a bit more serious about purchasing the material where I could find it, which of course does have ethical issues. And I made a big purchase of like 12 print copies of Fenrir off eBay, maybe in about 2021 or 2022. And it was, a couple $100. And unbeknownst to me, that was when the Ethan Meltzer prosecution was going on in the Southern District of New York. And, it was sealed at the time. And when I made that purchase, I started getting double screening at the airport every time I would go fly. It was like clockwork. And, every single checked bag would come back with, a TSA inspection slip. My pre-check application was denied. And it took about 2 years for that kind of scrutiny to lift. And so, nobody ever told me, your IP address was tagged to researching the Order of Nine Angles while there was a large terrorism prosecution going on. I think part of it too may have been I served in the Army. It was my first job after college. And of course, Ethan Meltzer was also in the military. So I think, if I were the FBI, there was a constellation of concerning details about my research into the Order of Nine Angles. I eventually did meet with the FBI. They didn't come to me. I reached out to them about something that I'd seen online that was a little too real. So I did call in a tip, and I met with some field agents and explained to them my interest and showed them what I had seen and talked to them about my research. And they said, yes, we're aware of the group. We're investigating it. We're investigating people who are interested in this ideology. What I had shown them was something that they said had not been on their radar previously. And they kind of thanked me for being a good actor as opposed to a bad one. And they said, if we had independently stumbled across this subset of Order of Nine Angles ideology, you may have received a knock on your door from people in blue jackets with yellow writing on the back that would have made your neighbors concerned. But they said basically, we now know your selectors are academic and research oriented, and like we know that you're not a problem. So what I'm trying to say is, there is an inherent risk to we live in a security state. There is an inherent risk to researching, especially on the internet, seriously politically extreme ideologies. We're not talking reading Mein Kampf. We're talking about the Order of Nine Angles, which instructs people in rape, pedophilia, and terrorism. And then I've never come across this, but I know Ali Winston and Jake Hanrahan have spoken about this too. Of course, with 764, there's a real risk of accidentally committing a crime when you're doing this research. For example, viewing CSAM material by accident. So I would warn people who are interested, maybe just stick to Wikipedia, stick to articles in the Rolling Stone. Don't go searching for the Telegram channels. I really stay away from those for the most part also because I'm not tech savvy enough to not accidentally commit a crime while doing this research. Also, there are better ways to spend your time than researching this. But,
Okay, so a big term for the Order Nine Angles is Nexium. And we mentioned it many times. And it also has a boat causal and an acausal meaning, right?
Yes. So Nexion is one of their own terms that causally, or in the real world, refers to an order of 9 angles cell, essentially. It has to be, I think, 3 or 4 members, and creating an order of 9, creating and running an O9A Nexion is one of the steps towards initiation in the sevenfold sinister path. So built into the ideology is the idea to spread it and convince others to join. Now, the Nexion also has another causal meaning, which is basically the heart center of the quote unquote higher civilization of any aeon. According to the cosmology, each of the 7 aeons has a physical civilization where the magical ethos of that aeon is most strongly embodied. So for the 5th Western aeon, Nazi Germany was the aeon's Nexion. It's where the forces of the acausal manifest themselves upon the earth in one particular civilization. So they say the Third Reich was the 5th aeon's Nexion. Acausally, that is metaphysically, the Nexion is the gate that is supposed to open in your mind along the journey of initiation, along the sevenfold path. And when this gate opens in your mind, you are able to perceive the full nature of being, which is the idea that there's a physical realm, the causal, and a metaphysical realm, the acausal. And when this Nexion opens in your mind, you become a master or a mistress of the order of 9 angles, and you're able to perceive and manipulate the magical forces that the order of 9 angles tries to use in order to tip the balance of each age, in order to drive the evolution of humanity away from Homo hubris into Homo Galactica and the Galactic Imperium. And that's really why I call the article Toward the Galactic Imperium. Everything is about moving the ages toward this space empire.
Okay. So the next question is a bit abstract. So you mentioned how Myatt borrows from other traditions. So how does he relate to Hermeticism and Gnosticism? And where does he differ from them in his understanding of physis and theos? And why is this important for their belief in their ability that they are able to transform both the individual and the world?
Yes. And I think I mentioned earlier in the interview, this was the most difficult part of the research for me to do because it required me to understand and compare variations and translations of ancient Greek. But physis, basically, according to the order of 9 angles, means the unfolding of being. So at the same time, it means unfolding in your mind the nature of reality. It also means apprehending the full nature of reality. It means being able to perceive that there is both a causal and an acausal realm. And theos is traditionally understood as knowledge of God in the corpus hermeticum. It's Pymander is interacting with Hermes, and Hermes imparts upon Pymander theos, which is basically knowledge of the divine, that he's reassured that there is a spiritual realm, and that Pymander can find eternal life represented by the knowledge of represented by divine knowledge. David Myatt reinterprets this to be divine knowledge itself, not knowledge of the divine, but the divine. And so part of the idea of the order of 9 angles is apprehending physis and theos. And when you fully understand theos, that's the end of the sevenfold steps, the sevenfold path of initiation, and you have given to yourself by the steps of initiation the power of the god to become immortal and to also impart your will upon both physical and acausal reality.
Yeah, I was reading some Order of 9 Angles zines from the 90s recently, both in the kind of black metal scene and connected to it. But also, there had some of them had direct connections with Richard Malt and other people involved in the Order of 9 Angles. And I realized that they also use this term physis as a term for like a martial art we're trying to develop. I don't know if you know anything about this. Yeah.
No, that's interesting. That's very strange.
Yeah, Malt and others practice this, and they had debates with other people. Is it like an effective martial art or not? And
Oh man.
Okay. Well, like most things in this world, that sounds very silly.
I mean,
Yes.
Myatt was claimed to have been trained in certain martial arts, right?
Yeah.
So maybe he was kind of, I guess, expounding on that. And just seeing him in like that little tweed vest or something, like doing some, moves or something in the green English countryside.
Yeah, on his bicycle with 3 gears.
Yeah.
So the Order of Nine Angles, they call there's several different types of magic that the Order of Nine Angles employs. I mentioned Aeonic magic, which is the ability to affect the evolution of the world, but they call the Sevenfold Sinister Way they call it physis magic, which is like a hermetic inner transmutation that occurs along the 7 steps of initiation to open the Nexian in your mind that then allows you to employ Aeonic magic to change the world, the cosmos, and history.
Okay. Can you talk a little bit about how Myatt's life and biography is also kind of connects to the development of the Order of Nine Angles and its ideas?
Yes. This is probably the part of the paper that I don't recall in most detail off the top of my head, but David Myatt, he claims to have been born in Tanzania. He claims his father was a colonial administrator, which is kind of where he gets the idea that empire is a good thing and that there are hierarchies of races. He apparently was very smart as a child, went to school to study physics, dropped out, got involved in, street thuggery, was always involved in Nazism with Combat 18 and Column 88 in the UK. And he claims to have been very bored in university, and then he started dabbling in esoteric magic and Satanism, where he claims to have met this unnamed mistress who was running the original Order of Nine Angles. That was a synthesis of 3 different other magical esoteric traditions that didn't have really Nazism involved. And then she, according to David Myatt, I think moved to Australia, and David Myatt decided to take over the group, and he kind of rewrote the teachings of this original Order of Nine Angles according to his own interests in like physics, the nature of being, ancient Greek philosophy and Hermeticism, esotericism, and then, of course, Nazism. And that's how you get the Order of Nine Angles very, very generally.
I think according to the story, Myatt also had a child with the daughter of this woman who was the original mistress of the Order of Nine Angles. I think some people believe this is actually true. I have no idea. But
I have no idea.
Yeah.
Yeah, I have no idea either. His autobiography, Mingath, like it's like a weird full recollection, as the subtitle, is an interesting text as well about Myatt and the Order of Nine Angles, because I think it was published in 2011. And that's the text in which he claims that he renounces all forms of extremism and claims to have been sorry. And he claims that that he had 3 wives, one of which who died of cancer, one of which who died by suicide, and that this broke him, and that he understood that the pathemathos of the Order of Nine Angles, the idea, the philosophy of gaining knowledge through difficulty, his own pathemathos, or learning through difficulty, was that death and killing is a bad thing, and so the death of his 2nd wife and suicide of his 3rd or whatever taught him in a very difficult way that violence and transgression were horrible things, and so he claimed to have renounced extremism as a result of these 2 tragic losses in his life. But the book, the short biography is so full of self-pity, and appeals to pity of the reader. And there are several texts that were published in 2013, and I think a couple interviews in 2015 and 2019 that I don't really believe that there were these 2nd and 3rd wives that died of cancer or died by suicide. I do personally think it's a crock of shit, but I can't. I couldn't prove it either way. So I point to these texts as this is how David Myatt tells his own history. Who knows if it's actually true? But I do think that the 2011 renunciation of extremism and then the publication of this autobiography are more of those sinister tricks that you're supposed to play in the Order of Nine Angles, where you keep people guessing and you hide your intentions. It's the purpose of the insight roll.
Yeah.
And so I think he's, masquerading as, a regretful Nazi Satanist or esoteric Satanist now, as opposed to actually having renounced any of this.
Yeah, I always saw it as a kind of way of ensuring that, he doesn't spend his retirement in prison either, because the O9A is kind of under constant threat of being prescribed in the UK. So like that.
Particularly in the UK, where even possessing the texts is a crime.
Yeah.
In the United States, you can have the books all you want. It's covered by the First Amendment, but I understand it's a little bit different in the UK. And this renunciation of the Order of Nine Angles and extremism is really interesting, because I know you guys have covered, the Turner Diaries and William Luther Pierce, or you've mentioned them at least before. While working on a project for school this semester, I found a bulletin that National Alliance published in 1984, where Robert J. Matthews, the founder of the American terrorist group The Order, after he had died in that fire in Washington State when the Order was being hounded by the FBI, William Luther Pierce wrote a bulletin to National Alliance that said, "Hey guys, keep it legal." Which is bullshit. Keep it legal. The Turner Diaries is not a prescription for violence or revolt or war against the state. Bob Matthews was out of control, and he did things that he should not have done. And literally, William Luther Pierce writes, "Keep it legal."
Yeah.
And it's an insurance policy.
Yeah, I mean, National Alliance got money from the from those robberies from the Order too. So you gotta
exactly
cover your ass.
Yeah, exactly. And so putting out, and it's the same reason too that, the Terrorgram guys write, in Minecraft, here's how to build a bomb in Minecraft, because it's a way to distance yourself by 1 or 2 degrees from actual incitement to violence and rely on First Amendment speech privileges in the United States to not have legal liability for incitement to violence.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, some years after David Myatt supposedly renounced extremism, as he calls it, Anton Long in 2005 did an interview with Joshua Sutter, specifically addressing Aryan nations. And in it, he said things like, we should hate our enemies as the subhuman scum they are, and said how Nazis should be in alliance with Al-Qaeda and such things. So, yeah.
Yes. And of course, Joshua Sutter, before his arrest, he was, I believe his position in the Aryan nations was the foreign minister for Islamic relations.
Yeah.
And then, of course, too, David Myatt infamously left the UK. I forget where in the Middle East, but he claims he converted to Islam and was trying to forge alliances between Islamic fundamentalist extremists and, the white power movement or white nationalists in the UK and the United States. And so I think I've got a good picture. It's the one picture of Abdulaziz bin Myatt, and he's kind of dressed like Osama bin Laden. He's got a camouflage jacket, I think a vest, and a hat and a beard, and he disappears. I think it was about 98 through 2008, and then he comes back to the UK, and then all of a sudden, almost a perfect correlation, Fenrir begins being published again in 2009. So there's a good break in the publication of Fenrir that coincides with Myatt's adventures and apparently in the Middle East.
So the Order of Nine Angles claims that it's not an actual order, that it's not like a membership based group, and I think in a way they are correct, at least how it is now. I think in the past, maybe this was not the case. I'm sure it wasn't, because recently, so you mentioned this history, there were supposedly 3 groups united in the 70s to form the Order of Nine Angles. One of those groups was the so-called the Temple of the Sun. And recently, a guy running a Substack called Dave Number 7, he wrote an ethical article that basically proved that the Temple of Sun was a real group that existed in Leeds in the 70s, and that David Myatt was a member and the leader of the group. So that was probably a membership-based group. And I found also a post by, I think, was it by Pointy Hat or Pointy One, which is one of the aliases used by Myatt, that stated how Order of Nine Angles doesn't have like membership since the late 80s, is what he said in that post, I think from the year 2000 or around there. But now it seems that this is true, that they are not really membership based, and they are revolve around this idea of self-initiation.
Yes.
So you cannot be initiated in some kind of a traditional sense by joining a group. You do it yourself.
Mhm.
So what does that mean?
Yes. It is, well, first of all, I think you're totally correct that I would imagine, I think it's correct that probably maybe through when Myatt left to go to the Middle East, I think the Order of Nine Angles kind of was a membership-based group where most people knew one another, and that there was maybe a central Nexian that they were all operating out of, and they all kind of knew one another. But I think after Myatt went to the Middle East is when the idea that the Order of Nine Angles as a decentralized, self-replicating ideology really took hold. And I don't know how it started taking hold when Myatt basically left. But I think it is correct to say that it is not a group with a membership roster, say the way Atomwaffen Division or the Base were. And there isn't really an impulse to recruit. There's only an impulse or an imperative to self-initiate and then kind of assist others in initiating as opposed to recruiting others. And I think there's a real difference in that. And it goes back to that Rachel Sterling assessment that I mentioned earlier on in the interview about the full body of teachings of the Order of Nine Angles are meant to test, select, weed out, and then screen in essentially people who are willing to understand the full ideology and commit themselves fully to the hermetic transmutation of the sevenfold sinister path, and then also the causal politics of accelerationist violence and terror.
Yeah.
And I know you guys have covered extensively. I mean, now there are all these decentralized Nexians around the world, and it's tough to say how much communication they have with one another. But what's interesting too is to note how the active Nexians all have slightly different practices. I mean, the NSO9A has somewhat different practices than, say, the Temple of Blood, which may have somewhat different practices from the Astral Bone Gnawers Lodge. And they all have, or WSA 52. Is it 52 or 352? I forget. But
I can't remember either.
Yeah, it doesn't matter.
Chloe's one, yeah.
Yeah. And I don't know if you've ever read any of the Nexian zine that WSA 352 publishes, but you can see the Order of Nine Angles imprinted all over it, but the teachings are somewhat different.
Yeah.
And I haven't, that's one of the more prolific zines that's being published right now, and I just really don't have the time or the interest to do a deep dive on at a certain point too, there isn't much to be gained, I think, from understanding all the different Nexians and their versions of the kind of physis magic and the aeonic magic or whatever that they're practicing, and which is why I chose really to limit my study in this article to the original teachings of the Order of Nine Angles, because that's the tree from which they all have branched off from.
Right. Yeah. I mean, from what I understand, a part of the self-initiation is also to start your own little group at some point.
I think that's the second or third stage. And the idea is that you would, as the initiate, you would have more of an understanding of the Labyrinthos Mythologicus than a new person. And so you're supposed to basically expose other people to the material. And if they want to initiate in, you're supposed to guide them. But it's very different, I think, than, say, recruiting other militants on like Iron March.
Right. So we mentioned insight roles many times.
Yes.
What is it in the context of this self-initiation?
So the insight role, and again, I can't remember if that's the second or third step of initiation. I just don't have them memorized anymore off the top of my head. So I wrote them down for a reason. And again, it's not worth memorizing this stuff. But the insight role goes back to Myatt's reinterpretation of Agamemnon, where there's a ancient Greek term called pathemathos, which means learning through suffering, that bad things in your life can be internalized and taken as a good form of new knowledge about the experience of life. David Myatt reinterprets that as wisdom or knowledge through hardship. And so an insight roll is something that you are supposed to do for up to 2 years as part of your initiation into the Order of Nine Angles, where you take on a physically, mentally, and morally difficult and challenging role within society that is supposed to be the opposite of things that you previously believe. So, for example, this is an outlandish example, but if you were if you were raised Catholic and you believe you shall not kill, and you were raised a Christian, you should take up an insight role as a militant extremist, and maybe you should go join the Islamic State and kill people in combat, because it is the exact opposite of what your previous mental state, worldview, and beliefs hold. And so part of the insight role is you're supposed to gain both causal and acausal insights. You're supposed to learn the wisdom through suffering. You're supposed to learn that killing in combat is something that you're actually capable of doing. So killing is actually possible, and it's not evil, it's amoral. And at the same time, that's supposed to give you causal skills, the ability to operate weapons, the ability to know how to behave in a firefight, maybe the ability to build bombs. If you were a pacifist, maybe you're supposed to take up an insight role as a neo-Nazi street organizer, and it gives you, an expanded sense of self and what you're capable of, while also giving you real-life practical experience propagandizing and publishing, bullshit material to recruit others.
I think some of them, like Joshua Sutter, also had the idea that insight role is supposed to not only help your personal development in this self-initiation work, but also kind of destabilize the world of the Magian as well, right?
Yes. At the same time, yeah. And that's why particularly the Order of Nine Angles specifies that killing in combat, join the army and kill in combat. It might seem, it does actually seem kind of counterintuitive that somebody who wants to join or wants to self-initiate into the Order of Nine Angles to, help destroy the West would actually say join the U.S. Army and participate in that endeavor. But the idea is that every life you take, every person you kill, if it comes with magical malintent, even if you're doing it in service of your country, that magical malintent also helps tip the balance of the magical ethos in the fifth aeon, which if enough people do it enough times, you could have an entire division of the Order of Nine Angles people fighting and killing in service of their country, but because their magical intent is hidden by their actions, their insight role, say, as a uniformed member of the armed services, the magical intent is still put out in the world with every life that they kill, and that supposedly will tip the balance of the evolution of the ages.
Okay. So, and what's the role of culling in this self-initiation?
Culling is a controversial teaching in the Order of Nine Angles. Culling is killing. It is basically culling the herd, and you are supposed to identify and kill people that are tested and are deserving of this crime. I say it's controversial within the Order of Nine Angles because, David Myatt got in a lot of trouble in 1998 when I think his name was Miles Copeland. Copeland set off a couple nail bombs in London. And the Practical Guide for Aryan Revolution was found in his house, which is a pamphlet that David Myatt is credited with having written. And the Order of Nine Angles since then has tried to say, oh no, culling isn't actually what it looks like. It's not actually killing people. It's some other thing. I forget how they try to explain it away.
I saw once that it can be any kind of socially deviant practice, stealing or something. I've heard a bunch of different variations of this.
No. If you read the texts on culling and Hostia, and if you read and this is why, earlier on I mentioned that Fenrir kind of represents the exoteric teachings of the Order of Nine Angles, because most of it's written in the form of fiction in Fenrir, but it's very much real life stories about, oh, here's how you cut somebody's throat at night, or here's how you commit a murder with a readily commercially available kitchen knife so that the police can't easily track who had the knife. It's, again, very juvenile. But I call bullshit when the Order of Nine Angles tries to say that culling is not actually designed, written as a practice to make people kill one another. Something that I was specific to note in my article is that I really wasn't going to engage with a full accounting of crimes and terrorism that is attributed to the Order of Nine Angles, because that is a whole nother can of worms. So I never really tried to point to, here's an example where culling was put into practice by a member of the Order of Nine Angles, but I know, I think Jake Hanrahan has covered the Maniacs murder cult out of the UK, or sorry, out of Ukraine and Russia, I believe. But you could view that as a form of O9A or O9A adjacent culling.
Yeah. I mean, both David Myatt as David Long and Richard Moult as Christos Beast defended culling in a bunch of interviews and specifically defined it as killing people in a very non-metaphorical way. And both of them said, like, it's what makes us what we are. This is like what sets us apart from other groups that claim the Satanist label, is that we like are pro-killing people.
Yes, and that goes back to Myatt's idea that evil is not evil. It has no values. It has no positive or negative connotation. That evil is actually amoral. Without morals, it just is as it is, the state of nature. And there's one text in particular, I believe, in Hostia called "Culling, Defiance, and Crime," and it is an outline of the causal tactics of the way to put this aeonic magic out into the universe and the cosmos while doing things like culling, defiance, and crime. Defiance would be, anything that aggresses the ethos of the Magian or the Nazarene, and that could be stealing, that could be pedophilia, that could be just maladjusted antisocial behavior. It's just the opposite of what you're supposed to do in the world, and that helps reduce the basically the negative balance of magical energies in the fifth aeon. And culling is very much one of those things that the Order of Nine Angles points to, because, of course, what is the first of the 10 commandments? Is thou shalt not kill. Right. So absolutely you should kill, because it aggresses both Christianity and Judaism's teachings.
Yeah. Right. What do they mean by the abyss?
Okay, good question too. The abyss is they call it the grade ritual of the abyss, and it is basically the make or break point between steps 6 and 7 of the initiation along the sevenfold path, where it is they call it an extremely dangerous, difficult step in initiation, and it requires it is both a physical and a mental task that requires a large road march, surviving on little food, and then many hours or days of self-isolation where you're just supposed to kind of meditate on the primordial forces of chaos. And the abyss is the point where you cross over from an initiate or a former member of Homo Hubris into Homo Galactica, or the advanced evolved mistress or magician. And there really isn't a more specific answer than that. The abyss is basically the space between being a three-dimensional being and a fourth and fifth dimensional magician that can manipulate history with magic. They claim it's very difficult. They claim it can drive you insane if you're not ready for the ritual. It is important to note that they don't even prescribe how long you're supposed to do this self-isolation and meditation. It's supposed to just come to the initiate. So you could do it for, 25 minutes on your lunch break, or you could go do it for 45 days in a cave. But yeah, the abyss is kind of, we talked a little bit before about the symbolic mediations. In an esoteric tradition, the abyss is the kind of symbolic mediation of the crossing between the old and the new. The unevolved and the evolved member of the Order of Nine Angles.
You already talked about Homo Galactica, and you just mentioned it in the Galactic Imperium. I don't know if is there anything to add there, or if not, we can move on to the next question.
I think we can move on. Yeah, it's just a vaguely described space empire, and it is
and a higher being, right? It's not human anymore. Yeah.
Yes, an evolved being that is immortal also. And really isn't clear if that's supposed to be physical or metaphysical immortality. I mean, it kind of alludes to kind of union with the primordial forces of chaos, which they refer to as Satan. But again, it doesn't all make perfect and full sense. And I think that's partially by design to allow new Nexians to create their own permutations of the ideology.
Yeah. I think that like some of the American Order of Nine Angles strains in the like small groups in the 90s, out of which Satra comes, they kind of mix this whole idea of Homo Galactica with some vampiric lore. So for them, like Homo Galactica is also like this a vampire, like predatory being, basically.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. And that, I don't really know where that comes from. But I don't want to derail the conversation, but there's an interesting text by Donald Barr called Space Relations that was written in the 70s, which is essentially about a predatory race of space aliens that go around kidnapping, enslaving, and molesting the youth of different offspring, or different, species of aliens. But so that kind of idea had kind of been out at the fringes for a while, I think.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Okay. So can you tell us what is the sinister dialectic of history, and how does it relate to aeonic magic?
Yes. This was one of the more interesting things that I kind of discovered and put together while I was doing this research for years about how does this entire worldview operate according to the people who believe in it. And the sinister dialectic of history is Myatt's own attempt to create a philosophy of history that is a lens of analyzing history and human events that stands up to rigorous analysis and other people can apply to their understanding of the unfolding of human events. And so the sinister dialectic of history assumes that the idea of the 7 root races from Helena Blavatsky and the different aeons from Aleister Crowley that are all mushed together in the Order of Nine Angles ideology, the sinister dialectic of history assumes that all of this is correct and that there is a tension or a push and a pull or a dialectic amongst evolutionary and de-evolutionary forces, magical forces in each specific aeon that must be tipped in order to move the cosmic calendar towards the next aeon. And so aeonic magic, I think I've mentioned already in the interview, is the type of magic that is used by the those who have completed the 7 steps of initiation and who are masters or mistresses of the Order of Nine Angles, and they use violence, transgression, and crime, physical actions that are charged with a magical intent to aggress the ethos of the West or the Nazarene, Judaism, and Christianity. Because if you do enough of these violent things with that type of specific magical intent, the balance of magical forces of the aeon will be shifted according to the sinister dialectic of history, and the course of history will change, will be moved back onto the naturally ordered path of no good, no evil, just hierarchy in nature, which will then eventually turn the wheel of time and cosmos of history into the next aeon.
Okay.
It really is kind of simple once you're able to put it all together, but it requires a ton of piecing together. And, I call it an attempt to create a philosophy of history because, of course, that's what Karl Marx actually did when he developed the dialectic materialism, which is a philosophy of viewing history. Myatt clearly sees himself as a very profound intellectual, and that he has discovered a new interpretation of history according to the balance of magical forces. And it's just science.
But then again,
fiction.
borrowing from a lot of different traditions, right? Like theosophy or whatever.
Yes. And he's drawing on as we mentioned earlier, ancient Greek Gnosticism. He draws upon Oswald Spengler. Basically plagiarizes from Francis Parker Yockey, and so
Yockey also lifted a lot of things from Spengler, right? As well, they're both kind of Spenglerian in some way, and Magian is the term that he took from Spengler, and so it's
yeah.
And so how how do they see, like, have a specific view of seeing, like, the role of Nazi Germany, but also, like, in historical terms, but also in magical terms, right?
Yes, I think we touched on this a little bit
Yeah.
earlier too, but
Mm.
Nazi Germany was both the physical Nexian of the fifth Western Aeon.
Mm-hmm.
It was essentially the physical manifestation of the higher civilization of the fifth Aeon that was that the evolutionary forces were supposed to flow out of. And I think there's a piece in Hostia where Myatt basically says, like, Hitler didn't even know that he was putting out this magic out there, but he was. And so that's why he's representative of the character of Vindex. He was accidentally doing aeonic magic without fully knowing that he was, and it's a lot of apologetics. Really, it's a lot of Nazi apologetics.
I mean, one of the things that, sorry, Ray,
No, it's fine.
that I think is, I guess, a kind of problematic question when talking about the O9A is their approach to race, right? I think a very common misconception about the O9A and a common label that's put on it is white supremacist, when that's not entirely accurate.
Yeah.
How do you understand their concept of race and racism, based on, I mean, what you've read?
Yeah, so you could definitely say that Myatt's non-esoteric work, the Reichsfolk, that quote unquote ethical National Socialism, is definitely a form of white supremacy.
Yeah.
And white power ideology that kind of crossed the Atlantic in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. But the Order of Nine Angles is something different. It's not quite white supremacy because race isn't really a primary function of the Order of Nine Angles. It's like species,
Right.
which is a form of scientific racism, you could say. But the Order of Nine Angles material really doesn't deal directly with the idea of Jews as a biological race, or whites as a biological race. It deals with, as we mentioned previously, Homo hubris as a species and Homo galactica as a species. So it is tough to try to call it. I mean, it's, if you were to strip away the esoteric bullshit, it is white supremacy, but you don't really find perfect white supremacy directly discussed in the Order of Nine Angles. Kind of the same way the Order of Nine Angles relies on Nazism and the esoteric interpretations of Nazism, as opposed to pure, Third Reich blood and soil politics, the way like William Luther Pierce and National Alliance did.
Right.
So I know it's a very unsatisfying answer, but
yeah, no, it's something that I think it causes a lot of confusion, because there are lots of non-white or members or practitioners of the O9A and Nexians, for example, a lot in Brazil and in South America, with that are made up primarily of not white people, or like Chloe Ortega's kind of own ideas about like Cambodians being Aryans and stuff like that. It's kind of difficult to explain to people sometimes that there's elements of, it's racist, but it's not necessarily the same as, like you said, National Alliance or some of these kind of more traditional neo-Nazi schools of thought.
Yeah. Yeah. And again, like, the search for perfect coherence is a fool's errand. I mean, current events are kind of seeing a rise of kind of Aryan nationalism in India, of all places, and that would seem counterintuitive with a strictly like Nazi racialist interpretation of what Aryanism is. But then you look back at some of the texts that actually informed the Nazi, mythology, that informed the politics of the Third Reich. And they absolutely locate the origins of Aryanism to the Indian subcontinent. Yeah. And I believe there's an inscription on a rock, I forget where, or a cliff in Iran, that talks about, is like the first mention of the Aryans on Earth, and it comes out of South Asia.
Yeah, I think I have only two more questions.
Okay.
So you said how Myatt sees himself as a philosopher of history. I think he claims that he actually wrote like a 3-volume or 4-volume book called The Logic of History, which is lost somehow when he traveled, and some parts of it were published in 1984. A text called Vindex.
Yes.
We read it on our podcast, and it was published at least one of the editions in '84 was published. It was published in the U.S. in the Liberty Bell Journal.
Yes.
At the time, kind of the main author in Liberty Bell was Revilo Oliver, which that's kind of interesting connection because Revilo Oliver actually was a classicist. So I looked at the available correspondence of Revilo Oliver from that time, hoping that I will see him mentioning Myatt, and I didn't find anything. Although he published in a lot of he mentioned the Liberty Bell in many of his letters in 83, 84, 85. Never mentioned Myatt. You also read Yockey's book Imperium, which we also read and analyzed both texts, but we actually didn't connect them so much. And you essentially through these texts you identify Myatt basically as a Yockeyan.
Yes, and I'm glad you asked this question because I also wanted to bring up Revilo P. Oliver because the dissertation that I'm working on traces essentially the thought of the American revolutionary right from the 1930s all the way up to the white power movement in the 80s, and Revilo Oliver is actually going to feature as a prominent Yockeyite or Yockeyist as well in the mid 60s. Has got a link between Francis Parker Yockey's ideology and the Turner Diaries, basically, and that's for another time. But yes, so as I was doing this research, and I had read Vindex, The Destiny of the West, or the Mythos of Vindex, The Destiny of the West, which is the pamphlet that was published by Liberty Bell in 1984, and then seeing the exact same terminologies everywhere throughout the Order of Nine Angles texts that were written by Anton Long. That's where I kind of developed the idea of an intellectual fingerprint of David Myatt. But one of the purposes of my project was to really identify all the historical origins of the different teachings of the Order of Nine Angles, because again, it is a syncretic esoteric tradition that it creates something new out of things that have been pre-existing. So part of my work was to find where did all these ideas come from? And once I'd kind of arrived at, okay, the idea of Destiny of the West, Vindex, and Imperium, and culture distortion, all of these things that were unique both to David Myatt's non-esoteric work and Anton Long's esoteric work made me think this has to have come from somewhere, because David Myatt isn't really making up anything new. He's just pulling from all these different other sources. And so that led me on a search for where did the idea of empire, imperium, destiny of the West come from? And these are all terms that are pulled directly from Francis Parker Yockey's 1948 text, Imperium, the Philosophy of History and Politics. And so I do believe that David Myatt pulled the vast majority of the the political philosophy of the Order of Nine Angles, the idea that there is a preordained historical destiny for the Aryan race to be an empire that rules over the earth and then rules over the galaxy. He pulls that directly from Francis Parker Yockey in a very uncreative way. And I think I did some comparisons of quotations from Yockey and David Myatt towards the end of my paper that show he is basically plagiarizing, essentially just summarizing in different words the exact same ideas of Francis Parker Yockey. Now, Yockey himself was a student of Spengler's works, and he's referred to in the very little scholarship on Yockey, he's referred to as a neo-Spenglerian. Yeah. And Yockey applies a very Spenglerian analysis to history, but Francis Parker Yockey also was trying to devise his own fascist philosophy of history and politics that deals with the hierarchies of cultures, higher and lower cultures, and culture distortion, and the health of cultures. And these are all ideas that Myatt basically lifted from Yockey and Imperium and just repackaged with magic and space travel.
Okay. Okay. My last question has to do with the relation of this Order of Nine Angles, David Myatt, esoteric worldview to their like, kind of exoteric politics, such as this accelerationist idea of supporting terror, and
Mhm.
also all of these so-called causal tactics that they have for the destruction of what they call the mundane masses of Homo hubris and so on. So
Yes,
I would
yes.
connect this to like we already went through this phase of like groups like Atomwaffen Division and all of their clones, which I would argue in some way were kind of more real Order of Nine Angles than David Myatt or Richard Moult ever
Mhm,
were in a sense.
mhm.
And but now we are like in the phase of groups that we talked about with Ali Winston and with Peter Korotayev to some degree, like 764 and
Mhm.
what is the MKU, the Maniacs Murder Cult,
Yeah.
Yeah,
and No Lives
yeah.
Matter and so on. So
Mhm.
Ali Winston was a bit skeptical how much these people are, in a strict sense, Order of Nine Angles people. Like, do they really do the sevenfold way, self initiation way, and so on? But I think in some other way, the way they talk about, they use this Myatt's worldview to justify the abuse and murders they're doing. Like they formulate it specifically as a way to evolve into this higher being, the predatory being, which, as David Myatt said, he said it himself in one of his autobiographies, I think is an Anton Long, that he decided that his goal will be the creation of ruthless individuals, basically. And that this
Mhm.
kind of ruthlessness is actually a characteristic that you evolve into something higher and that you see
Yes.
the rest of humanity as your prey, basically.
Yeah, he
Yeah.
he part of the teachings of the Order of Nine
Mm.
Angles, again, back to this idea that evil and Satan are amoral as opposed to immoral,
Mm.
is that it is natural to learn to exceed your learned inhibitions that are promoted by generally Christianity and Judaism, and those are both de-evolutionary teachings. And so to evolve, you have to learn to have no morals. And so that's how you can justify things like 764 or No Lives Matter, the National Socialist Order of Nine Angles, and I think it's the afterword or the foreword to the 666th edition of Siege, is that, we're now carrying the trident from neo-Nazism to neo-Nazism, the idea that we don't even believe in a politics anymore. We only believe in transgression as a form of, ruthless but also politically rootless terrorism. That the point is just to sow chaos, discord, violence, and terror in order to nihilistically destroy everything and transgress the worldview of the Magian or the Jew or Christianity,
Right.
Judeo-Christianity in the West. And that's kind of why I finished my paper with a discussion briefly about, what do we call this? And I decided on neo-fascism because there are these debates in the scholarship about what is fascism, and there really is no consensus, which
Yeah.
is an interesting debate in and of itself. There's even less work on what is the idea of neo-fascism, and I tried to propose a working definition that deals with basically self-contained, impotent, and hidden politics of violence, reaction, and terror. That there's a claim to a political vision, but there's no possibility of even achieving it. But people still do it anyway, and that's part of what makes the ideology so disgusting. Is that I don't even think anymore the people that say they're committed to this accelerationist ideology really even believe that the futurist state or the utopia that previous movements used to envision arising from the ashes
Yeah.
is even possible anymore. They just believe in burning it all down. And that is almost like a psychological reading of the motivations of this type of politics and terrorism that is tough for a historian to try to figure out what to do with, because I think it would require some sort of psychological explanation, and I'm just not qualified to do that. But I think, and I don't want to fall back into like the authoritarian personality scholarship of the 1950s, but there's got to be a way that I just don't quite have yet to explain the motivation for uh, violence and terrorism that I think the people who participate in it know will achieve nothing.
Yeah.
It's impotent violence and it's impotent terrorism and it's impotent politics, but people still do it.
I mean, there are a few of these kind of strains of neo-fascism or post-fascism that I would kind of call a kind of nihilistic fascism, and
Yeah.
they they exist for decades, and like a lot of like Evolians also come
Yeah.
to that point. Also, of course, James Mason and Siege. So the whole idea is, nothing is worth of saving anymore. What you need to do is destroy the world, and then a new golden age will appear, or a galactic empire, or something like. So it's a way to justify ideology of total destruction. Yeah.
Yeah. And it's, I mean, I in the rest of my work that I'm doing on some of these groups from the 30s, then the 60s and 70s, it's a bit of a controversial argument that I'm making for somebody in grad school to say that these ideas and worldviews actually do have an internally logic and coherence. Like it's tough to recognize it from the outside because it just looks like insanity and senseless violence. And I'm not trying to justify or be sympathetic or empathetic to these ideas. I'm just trying to show that when viewed from the inside out, there is a coherence. So if you have maybe if you have a pre-existing set of grievances, it helps explain why these ideas do take hold over people, is because it offers a justification to behave politically and socially horrifically and violently the way your otherwise well-adjusted and normal morals would probably prevent you from doing.
Yeah.
And to make a larger point, I think also it's the reason why academia has really shied away from studying these types of ideologies, because they do seem senseless and incoherent. But and it's tough to say, well, if you understand it from the inside out, because then you run the risk of actually justifying it by saying you need to understand it from the inside out. But at risk of totally not understanding any of this really nihilistic and horrific, violent extremism, I think people do need to do this work to try to understand it from the inside out. And it's difficult. I mean, this was not the most fun thing to do with the Order of Nine Angles. I mean, it took maybe about 3 years or 2 or 3 years to complete. But I'm glad I did it. I mean, I remember finishing it and saying, like, fuck you guys. I got you dead to rights. I know what you're about. And it was personally satisfying to be able to put it on full display, expose it. Other people have done exposures of it, but to also show this is how this ideology works. This is the relationship between this bizarre esotericism and what we would recognize more easily as political terrorism. This is how it functions to the people that believe in it. And I also relied on some of the most horrific quotes that I could find in Fenrir to similarly allow their own ideology to judge itself in the mind of the reader. There's no way you could read what I've written and say, oh yeah, this stuff is great. You're supposed to read it and say, Jesus Christ, what the fuck?
Yes.
Yeah.
But I agree with you. I mean,
that's my approach.
I think it is super important to understand these groups and how they look at themselves and look at the world, because they are obviously actually existing phenomenon, right? They're people follow this. It exists. There are people who die because of this stuff. And it absolutely should be studied. And I'm very glad that you did it. Like I said at the top of the episode, if only to just throw it back in Myatt's face and be like, you see, here's the scholar that isn't Rachel Sterling. It's not you.
Yeah. Well, yeah. Thanks. I am pretty proud of this paper. It's unfortunately behind a paywall.
I was about to ask,
like most academic. Yeah, but like most academic articles. But if anybody reaches out to you guys and says, do you have it? Feel free to send it to them. I think it's important to kind of share this stuff.
Okay, great.
You hear that, patrons? Yeah.
Okay. I mean, Andrew, thank you so much for talking to us, and thank you for doing this research. It's an excellent article. I'm really glad you did it. You should be proud of it. It's great.
No, thank you. Thank you very much for having me on. You guys, I think Allie Winston made a comment and I echo it. You guys do really incredible work, particularly, following the stupid online debates in the Order of Nine Angles. And there's no way I was going to spend my time doing that.
Okay.
So I do appreciate that you guys do it. And the neat thing is, there's a handful of people like yourselves, Jake Hanrahan, a couple of the other journalists that are each kind of doing little pieces of the work to put together the full picture. So, it's somewhat of a collaborative effort. But thanks again for having me on. This was really fun, and I hope it helped explain how the Order of Nine Angles ideology functions in the minds of the people that adhere to it.
For sure.
I think he
I don't
definitely
think
did.
anybody's done a better job than you, I gotta
No.
say.
For sure.
Thank you. I really do appreciate it.
All right.
All right.
Well, thanks everybody for tuning in, and we'll see y'all soon. Thanks, Andrew.
Thank you. Bye.
Yep. Bye-bye. Thanks, guys.